I've always thought, like, if I were born and, like, they're like, "Arthur, you're the king of England," I would 100% believe, like, Jesus Christ put me there. Like, no doubt. I would be like, "Yes, this is ordained."
Yeah.
Especially if you pulled that sword out of the stone that nobody else could get.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the books? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the book!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to the Propaganda Loves You Book Club. We are excited to be starting our series of conversations on the third book in the series. Before we talked about On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. We talked about When Affirmative Action Was White by Ira Katz-Nelson. And this is our third book. Just a reminder, we have a Twitch channel, and I will be live reading the chapters on our Twitch channel. So if you go to Propaganda Loves You on Twitch and hit subscribe and enable notifications, you should get some alert when a new reading has been posted, and it should stay on the channel for up to a week after the initial recording. So if you like to get your audiobooks that way, the free way, please subscribe. Don't tell the publisher what I'm doing. I'd like to keep doing it. This third book that we're discussing is called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. It was co-authored by David Graeber and David Wengrow. I'm going to give a little bit of a background on these two authors. David Wengrow is currently Professor of Comparative Archaeology at the University College of London. He got his doctoral degree from the University of Oxford in archaeology, and he's done extensive field work in Africa and the Middle East, and has written several books on ancient Egyptian culture and civilization going back to, I think, 10,000 BC or more. So really well-published archaeologist in that field, one of the co-authors of this book. The other author, David Graeber, passed away several years ago, I think in 2020. He was an anthropologist and a professor at the London School of Economics. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He was later a Yale professor of anthropology, and many of his supporters alleged that his contract at Yale was not renewed because of political differences he had with the university. He was very influential in the Occupy Wall Street movements when those kicked off. He happened to have written a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which was published a couple of months before the Occupy protest started, so it was very timely for him to get involved with that, and he kind of became a darling of the political left. A lot of people sort of gravitated to his way of thinking and writing. And so he's got a lot of credibility on the political left. He's done extensive ethnographic fieldwork in Madagascar, studying cultures that were formed by escaped slave populations. And I think in 2018, he wrote another article that turned into a book called Bullshit Jobs. And just a quote from that to give you a sense of his perspective. He says, "Huge swaths of people in Europe and North America spend their entire working lives performing tasks they secretly believe do not need to be performed. The moral and spiritual damage that comes from this situation is profound. It is a scar across our collective soul." So very anti-bullshit job kind of guy. He thinks that humanity should be about something meaningful, and he spent most of his career trying to figure out the history of what humanity has been doing. This book is kind of a testament to that. These two authors worked together for about 10 years, going back and forth with manuscripts, writing this book together. So it was a very collaborative, long-term project they worked on. And according to their surviving author, Wengrow, the manuscript was finished a few months before David Graeber died. So very timely completion on this project. The book itself is how we understand the story of humanity. Most experts believe conservatively that human beings, as we exist now as a species, have been around for about 200,000 years, possibly more, but about 200,000 years. And most of what we think of as human history is condensed into the last 6 to 8, maybe 10,000 years or so. So really what we think of as ancient human history is really only a fraction of the whole scale of how long we've been on this planet. And I think this book does a good job of beginning to explore more of that mystery behind what we feel like we already know. So just to get us going, I guess, a question for us to think about before we jump into the material of the book. Excuse me. I know we've all already read the first 2 chapters, so try to bracket what we've learned so far. But just in general, what would we say is the typical grand narrative about human history when somebody tries to summarize how humanity got from wherever we started to where we are now in the 21st century? How do we typically tell that story? Can we just rehearse that a little bit?
Yeah, I could do a take on it, Arthur, if you, you want.
Yeah. Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so human history, and you're talking specifically like the general story that we've been told. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I think it always kind of generically goes along the lines of developed as hunter-gatherer tribes, and then as agriculture became a thing, that's what started developing towns and cities and creating more of that hierarchical structure. Industrialization followed from that, which kind of led into the birth of cities and population centers, and kind of because of the population centers needing some organizing structure that would scale past a hunter-gatherer tribe of like 50 people, right? So how do you organize a community of now hundreds or hundreds of thousands of people? Yeah, I guess that's kind of where I think of hunter-gatherer, agriculture, industrial evolution to modern day people, I guess.
I think I kind of view it the same way, maybe more like philosophically, because I had to read Hobbes's Social Contract in college. And yeah, it's more like, for me, I guess, like, there's chaos in the world and we're all murdering each other because we're all just brutes. And then order comes in and we're all saved. And it's, it happens to be an economic system. And so I guess, totally, like industrial revolution and agriculture all play a part into that. And this was a really good, not to get into the book, but it was a really good tying of all that.
Yeah, I like 2 things one thing that each of you said, or 2 things I want to pull out that seem significant. And Kodie, what you were saying is that large concentrations of people, like large cities, large population centers, are really something that emerges after agriculture, after complex hierarchies have formed to organize social setups, right? That's one idea that we inherit from the general narrative about human history, that before agriculture, there were just small little gatherings of people. They weren't really highly densely populated or concentrated. And I think that's one claim that the book is going to challenge in a big way, that before agriculture, there actually were large concentrations of people, large cities, large population centers, and that agriculture wasn't the beginning of that. But that is something that most people, even most professional historians, will continue to repeat. Like, I think I even might be speaking out of turn because it's been a long time since I've read Sapiens, but I think that is one thing he repeats in Sapiens. Yuval Noah Harari, is that most people only knew like up to like 1,000 people or something. It was small groups of people. And the thing you said, Arthur, that stuck out was violence, and sort of how the trend has gone from chaos and violence and so-called barbarity towards more peaceful relations among people. And I think that's a second claim that the book is going to challenge in a big way, and that it was possible before agriculture and complicated civilizations to have egalitarianism broadly construed, fairness and goodwill between people. Those are 2 big claims I think that we're going to work on in the book. Let's jump into the first chapter, shall we? I got a couple of things that I want to hit on, but I encourage you guys to jump in with what you have as well. I thought we could start just on page 4. This whole chapter is kind of like setting the stage for the rest of the book, in terms of they're trying to explain how they want to have the conversation throughout the book. And I think in terms of writing, the book is interesting in that it's not really a linear narrative that starts as far back as possible and progresses up to the near present day. It's kind of circular in that they do this sort of thing in the first chapter where they're zooming out and talking about the conversation itself. The second chapter is about European contact with indigenous populations in North America. And that moment in history, what we might think of as the colonial period in North America, is the starting and ending point for the book in a lot of ways. They'll start there and then they'll go back deeper into history, and then they'll bring the book back to that point to sort of reiterate the arguments that they're making. So they spend a lot of time in this first chapter talking about what they want to talk about. It's kind of a meta thing. But on page 4, they say, quote, "To just give a sense of how different the emerging picture is, it is not clear now that human societies before the advent of farming were not confined to small egalitarian bands. On the contrary, the world of hunter-gatherers as it existed before the coming of agriculture was one of bold social experiments resembling a carnival parade of political forms far more than it does the drab abstractions of evolutionary theory. Agriculture, in turn, did not mean the inception of private property, nor did it mark an irreversible step towards inequality. In fact, many of the first farming communities were relatively free of ranks and hierarchies, and far from setting class differences in stone, a surprising number of the world's earliest cities were organized on robustly egalitarian lines with no need for authoritarian rulers, ambitious warrior politicians, or even bossy administrators." So this is sort of a general statement they're making. They're not dropping a lot of sources. I think it's really just a preview into some of the more detailed chapters we'll get later on. But how does this idea just sort of land with you guys right away of just like some of the typical assumptions we make about what the development of agriculture meant for human culture? They're automatically trying to turn on their head and saying that's not, agriculture means hierarchy. They're saying, no, not necessarily. You can have a non-hierarchical form of agriculture. Do these notions just sort of, I don't know, do they just make you curious and want to know more, or they kind of like strike you? Do you have any initial reactions to this kind of claim that they're making?
Yeah, I guess we're told like agriculture made hierarchy inevitable, and like surplus food goes to the kings and the taxes and the armies. But yeah, I guess history shows like farming doesn't, or rather like I guess people mix like farming and foraging and seasonal like leadership. And so it's like, I don't know, I guess it was really interesting just to hear about this. I don't know, kind of not really a thought. It's hard to put it together there, I guess. But yeah, just like the mixed use instead of like just the linear tale that we're told was really interesting. And I have not really studied a lot of like agriculture in general. And it's really fascinating to have examples of the time to highlight this, because from our perspective so far in the future, it just, yeah, it's like a tale that gets passed on forever and becomes unquestioned.
I don't know if this is super helpful, but I'm gonna say it anyway. When you like that section there's a couple things that stood out to me. One is talking about like how agriculture doesn't necessarily lead to private property or private, like ownership. And I was just thinking through like, yeah, I guess that would be a weird concept to think about probably for a lot of people in the United States. Like, what does that mean? Like, if we don't own the farms, or if a farmer doesn't own a farm, and like, what does that model look like? And what it made me think about, this is the part that's probably not that helpful, but on Netflix, there was Rebel Moon. Did you guys watch that on Netflix? It was a Zack Snyder film, and it was, I mean, like, if you can appreciate Zack Snyder, it was the first one was one of, I actually thought it was pretty good. I mean, it's a knock on Star Wars, or it's a version of Star Wars, I guess. But the point of bringing it up is like it's this moon that's a farming moon. Right. And then it's got this whole Seven Samurai thing of like heroes coming together to defend this farming moon against this evil empire that's coming in to try and take their crops. But it made me think about that society, because in that society, like they're obviously arranged in some way where it's like they have elders that and people that are responsible for the harvest, but they communally own like all of the farmlands. Right. And they work them as a community. And that's kind of like how they survived. So it's just an interesting concept to me. And I think like that stuff still exists today in places. I mean, if you look at like Amish groups of populations, right, that's kind of how they operate, communally own these farms and locations, communally own hand-built furniture and stuff like that. And then, they all benefit from like the selling of these things. I'm completely out of my depth when talking about the Amish community. But in general, like I guess that's what I was kind of thinking of. That's examples of ways that could actually work, if that makes sense.
That was really great, I think. And there's actually, the Wandering Goat, where I worked at a coffee shop. They source like beans from these like communal farms. There's one called like Cafe Femenino in Peru, where it's like women owned and there's collectives. And so there are other like real examples too in modern history. But yeah, I guess to your point, you said it a lot better than whatever I was rambling about. Just that, like, yeah, for billions of years, well, whatever, people have farmed land without billionaires for thousands of years. And the idea that, yeah, it just goes right to private property is ridiculous. And it kind of made me think of the movie Ants, if you've ever seen,
Yeah.
Okay, don't, it's directed by Woody Allen, so take what you will. And it's not as good as Bug's Life, but it's kind of the same thing where they're all doing all the work for, one person. You don't have to accept that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, those are great. Yeah. I was really empathizing with your reaction you were kind of struggling with, Arthur. It's like how it just sort of changes your perspective and like
Yeah.
you don't know what to say. It's just like it's different. I don't know. I can't put words to it.
Yeah,
It's just different.
definitely.
But yeah, it does that. This kind of, especially the perspective this book takes, definitely does that a lot. It just forces you to be like, what is history? What is the narrative? What's the meaningful arc here? And I think to your point, Kodie, like there are many different examples. I think that's one argument they come back to in this book again and again is there's no one singular way that humanity was in history and we progressed neatly in this straight line towards where we are now. That the more evidence we gather back into the deep past, the more it seems like they were very, very, very different ways of doing things all across the board. And so what they're encouraging us to do in a big way is just open up our imagination about what's possible in human history. And that's one critique they make against Rousseau, and I think Hobbes, but Rousseau specifically. In the second chapter, they're like, he just lacked imagination in a big way when he came up with this grand narrative about human history, and a lack of imagination is not an excuse for saying that's the truth, right? Like just because you can't imagine it otherwise doesn't mean the version that you came up with has to be true. The other thing you said, Kodie, that it was like this private property concept. And people get really reactionary about the idea that private property should be abolished because they think, well, what about all the stuff I own? There's a difference between private and personal property, like your toothbrush, your clothes, your house, your dwelling unit. These things are personal property, things that you need and use every day to survive. Private property is the idea that you can mark out a geographic area in the dirt and say, this is mine. And when Europeans were coming into contact with indigenous groups, they were like, what are y'all doing? Like that conceptually just doesn't even make sense to us that a person could claim this part of the earth as their own. Like that doesn't make any sense to us. And so it really, you see this intellectual clash between them on the issue of private property that I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
One example from this chapter that I think we could talk about, and then maybe if you guys have anything else from chapter 1 you want to talk about, we could hit on. And I think they summarize their argument at the end of this chapter. So maybe we could wrap up there before we go into chapter 2. But the one example I wanted to point to is on page 14. So one of their points in this chapter is that in the last several decades, a lot of new evidence has come out from deeper and deeper into the past. Archaeological evidence of buildings, evidence of tools and utensils, skeletons, burial grounds, all kinds of different things. And there's a big push intellectually to start to put together a meaningful story about all this new evidence. And this book, they're claiming, is their attempt to start that retelling of that story. And so one of the examples they point to on page 14 is called Romito 2. I'll read a little bit from the paragraph and then I'll just kind of summarize it. But Romito 2 is the 10,000-year-old burial of a male with a rare genetic disorder. And that disorder is called acromesomelic dysplasia, a severe type of dwarfism which in life would have rendered him both anomalous in his community and unable to participate in the kind of high-altitude hunting that was necessary for their survival. So there's evidence of a burial of this person who had a severe genetic condition where they had to be cared for, basically, right? And the idea we have about ancient human history, hunter-gatherer societies, is that they were violent and brutish and sort of cutthroat. and that compassion and kindness weren't really like high up on the list of important things to be doing with your time. But this person who had this disorder lived into early adulthood at least. And so this person had to be cared for constantly. They had to have their food provided for them. They had to have like mobility assistance, all kinds of things in the society in order to survive, not only through childhood, but well into adulthood. And the way that this person was buried suggests that they were an honorable member of their community, right? And so we have examples of people who we would assume would just sort of be cast aside. I mean, we think about like ancient Sparta, if the baby wasn't quite right, they just kick it off a cliff. That's the trope we get anyway. Thanks, Hollywood.
Also, Zack Snyder. I don't.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot that was Zack Snyder. Yeah. So that's like the idea we get about these ancient groups. But here we have evidence that there was compassion, there was kindness, there was like a sense of valuing individual humans beyond, can you hunt? Can you fish? Can you gather food? If not, you're useless. That's sort of the idea we tend to get. So have you guys heard about this before? This person, I think the New York Times did an article about it way back, but I don't know if this was the first time you'd heard about this case or if you'd heard about it before.
No, this is first heard from me.
Yeah, same. And I would totally agree. Like my learned viewpoint is that this person would be like left to die. So it's, really interesting.
I just marked something down. It might have been in the second chapter, but the connection to this specifically was more like, they take care of this person. They would have had to like, go hunt, feed this person, like bring food to them. And later in one of the chapters, I think it talks about how the whole concept of giving food to someone in need is like a foreign concept to the Europeans that come into that. So I think that we will hit on that later, but that's like the connection of those two things to me. And then thinking about today or yesterday, Trump saying we're going to remove the homeless people from Washington, D.C. Like, why? Because they're an eyesore on him when he's driving to his golf course. Like the juxtaposition there between those two things to me is just insane. Like that's where we are as a society right now. What do we do with the people that need help the most? I don't know, put them in camps or something. Like I guess we'll find out. But
no, that's a great point. Yeah, I remember a lot of that from the second chapter, I think, of some indigenous people being like, you let people go hungry. That doesn't make any sense to us. Like we give whatever we have. That's definitely part of the indigenous critique. And just a general question that was on my mind as I was preparing notes for today is a lot of our notions of progress, of social advancement have to do with technology, with the idea that as technology advances, life gets better for everybody, gets more convenient, gets easier, gets more comfortable. And we have this assumption that as technology gets better, everyone's lives across the board will tend to get better. But another thing we've talked about on the podcast a lot is just the basic value of compassion, of mutual aid, of caring about each other. And I'm curious, because of like how these narratives we have about how humanity went from a place of cruelty and barbarity towards greater and greater compassion as technology improves. Are those actually on the same path going up, or does compassion go one way and technology go the other way? Like as technology improves, can we see, I mean, what you're saying about Trump is an example of it, of how advanced technology actually is combined with less compassion and more cruelty and more hierarchy and less freedom, and how these things are actually kind of inverse. I don't know. It's just a general theme I'm picking up on as we're reading.
I think totally inverse. And I just read an article maybe yesterday or 2 days ago where Sam Altman of OpenAI said something to the effect of, children born today are the luckiest children to ever have been born because they'll have my product, which they all say. And it's like, I think it's totally inverse. The other thing too is like from a utilitarian perspective, which just measures like maybe, objective numbering, one could argue that like human suffering is actually at the height right now. And actually society has gone to the way where we are the most suffering right now, just due to pure volume of individual suffering.
yeah, I think I might have a slightly different take. I agree that's what we're seeing, but I don't necessarily think it's because of technology. I think more so it's like, what's the underlying motivation behind the development of the technology. And it's like, at least, I mean, working in the tech sector, everything's about improving productivity, right? Like, what do we do to make people be able to do more with less or do more work in less time and stuff like that? And what's the end state? The end state is, how do we earn more money, right? I feel like with technology, if the end state was different, like, how do we make a better society, or how do we make more equal outcomes for everybody? Like, if there was some other focus other than just, making your nut, I guess, if I want to use the recent South Park reference there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point to bring up. What's the purpose of the technological advancement? And part of the reason why we've seen so much tech advancement in the last few centuries, even the last few decades, is there's a lot of profit in it. There's a lot of money in it, and that's a strong motivation to improve tech. But like you're saying, you could have different values motivating those advancements. One of the things that leftists regularly critique about technology and stuff is like, well, if tech's supposed to be good, where are the flying cars? We should have flying cars by now at this point. But what your comment made me think about, there's another book I used to teach called Kids These Days by Malcolm Harris. And it is about the millennial generation and sort of the educational culture we grew up in, and its relationship to technology and everything. But he has this moment in the book where he's talking about, I can't remember the cartoon. It's some political cartoon or maybe a kid story from the mid 20th century. But basically this kid is in a typical grade school and he's overwhelmed with homework after school and he wants to spend more time playing with his friends. And so he invents this machine that allows him to set up like a second or third pencil and piece of paper, and it'll copy all of his movements and he can sort of duplicate his efforts. And so he does his homework and he does his friend's homework really fast. And so they're done with it faster and they have more time for their own play. And sort of the moral of this is like a technological advancement. What's the point of it is to save more time so that you have more self-directed free time to enjoy your time in life, which is this is like the central value of communist thought, is like increasing self-directed free time for people in general. And so the teacher finds out about this technology, and instead of being like, yay, you used your ingenuity and your smartness to save yourself time, she simply gives him more homework to do, right? And this is what happens in the factory when the boss finds some new technology that allows you to make, previously you were making 10 widgets a day. And then the boss came up with this technology and you can make the same widget twice as fast. And so you could just have half a day of work where you still make your 10 widgets and then you knock off after lunch basically and go home. And so the boss gets the same amount of productivity. You get to save some free time. But instead of that being the case, the boss says, no, you still have to work all day. You're just going to produce twice as much for me now. And so that's where I think this tie to productivity comes in and why people are increasingly miserable with advanced tech. It's because it never ends. There's no end point you can find with this kind of productivity obsession.
That's happening right now all across the tech sector with jobs being, so like, the story is always, we're developing AI to help you to make your job easier, right? Like that's what's going to happen. Yeah, if you were going with your analogy there, Joe, that's great. Let me work 2.5 days a week and I'll do the same amount. And nope, we're just going to cut half your team or whatever and make you do 8 times the amount of work with this technology. Eventually hoping to get to, well, let's just remove people altogether and we'll just use computers for the ultimate profit.
Before I jump to this argument summary at the end of the first chapter, is there anything that stuck out to you guys in this first chapter you wanted to hit on before we move along?
Yeah, there's just a couple things. The first is just a quote from the very beginning of the chapter, because I think it's just worth thinking about throughout this entire book. Like, it's literally the first page. It's the last paragraph. Essentially, the question is, are humans innately good or innately evil? But if you think about it, the question framed in those terms makes very little sense. Good and evil are purely human concepts. It would never occur to anyone to argue whether a fish or tree were good or evil, because good and evil are concepts humans made up in order to compare ourselves with one another. And I just really like that framing, because it's like, when you think about it that way, like, yeah, we come up with those concepts and then we individually have our own interpretations of what is good and evil. So we might think that that's a universal thing, but it's definitely not. You know, the administration right now has an idea of what they think are evil people, right? And I mean that goes all around. So I really like that, the way to think about that in general.
Yeah, I think they kind of get into that thought a little later in the chapter where they discuss, does morality arise from, like Hobbes thinks morality arises from the social contract or whatever. So yeah, totally. It's very interesting to put morality onto other people and then to just view it as ourselves in these like categories that we're born into and told exist, like good and evil. And like, I don't know, I just really like your point where it's kind of subjective. We do have our own interpretations of that. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I think it's the reason that I tend to gravitate more towards like the Buddhist conception of morality, even though it's not really like moralism in the Buddhist sense. It's like, what is suffering and stress and how do you make less of it? That's the essential point of the whole Buddhist framework, is like reducing and eliminating suffering and stress. And like even in animals, you can't have a conversation with your cat about good versus evil, but if your cat has a brother or sister and their brother or sister is suffering in an obvious way, your cat notices that suffering. And like if they have a good relationship, you can notice kindness between animals when they notice one another suffering. And I think that's a better framework to work with than good versus evil in this sort of capital G, capital E kind of way.
Makes sense. And then the only other quote that I had from the first chapter that I thought was interesting was, it's close to the end. I think it's on page 20. The pages before this kind of go into talking about how there had been multiple instances of Western individuals either getting captured or somehow ending up in Native American society, and then later on, after being either ransomed or escaping, voluntarily going back to that society. So I wanted to just read this one paragraph because it talks about some of the reasons why these individuals decided to do that. So, many who found themselves embroiled in such contests of civilization, if we may call them that, were able to offer clear reasons for their decisions to stay away from their erstwhile captors. Some emphasized the virtues of freedom they found in Native American societies, including sexual freedom, but also freedom of the expectation of constant toil in pursuit of land and wealth. Others noted the Indians' reluctance to ever let anyone fall into a condition of poverty, hunger, or destitution. It was not so much that they feared poverty themselves, but rather that they found life infinitely more pleasant in a society where no one else was in a position of abject misery. This was the thing that I was trying to find earlier, but and then just comparing to, again, like, you know, removing homeless people from streets, like, you know, I guess the Native American thought process on that would be like, well, let's just make them not homeless. That's a really good way to remove homeless people. But anyway, yeah, that quote stuck out to me.
Blasphemy.
Yeah, I just, a lot of those stories about people, like even Westerners, getting kidnapped and then getting freed from the Native Americans, being like, actually, I kind of liked it there better. I'm just going to go back. That's a huge indictment on Western culture.
My takeaway from chapter 1 is where Hobbes, I guess, like just like the motivation of Hobbes, you know, and this whole social contract in general. I know Hobbes wrote this around 1650 and Charles II was in charge, and he really was trying to justify the monarchy and state. And so it's like, it's total propaganda. And I love how the book says that it's not based off of any archaeology or any sort of backing. It's pure philosophical speculation, which is most of the things I studied. And it's just, you know, anybody can sit there and gaze up at the stars and come up with a theory, but it's not, you know, provable by any means. So just there is motive, and, you know, it's definitely propaganda.
Yeah, for sure. They get into that with Rousseau too in the second chapter, his famous essay on the origins of inequality or social inequality, and how like even in his essay, he's like, oh, this is just a hypothetical theory I'm making up on the spot to win this essay contest. I don't actually write. I make music. This is just a hobby. And then historians today are like, no, he was totally right. That was it. It's like, what are we doing? The only thing that I wanted to mention from the end of this chapter, on page 24 going into 25, the first paragraph of this last section on what's to follow, they do a lot of things, like just from a reader point of view in this book, parts of the book are challenging in the way they write it because they're sort of I don't know, the intended audience doesn't seem to be like a very general audience. It feels like people who are vaguely familiar with some sort of critical theory or have some sort of schooling in philosophy and stuff like that. So there's moments where it kind of feels like the text can be alienating and difficult in certain ways, but they do a good job of always circling back to their argument and reiterating what questions they're following. And I at least appreciate that even when the text is difficult. So on page 24, going over to 25, just this one paragraph I think is a good example of that. They say, in this book, we will not only be presenting a new history of humankind, but inviting the reader into a new science of history, one that restores our ancestors to their full humanity. Rather than asking how we ended up unequal, we will start by asking how it was that inequality became such an issue to begin with, then gradually build up to an alternative narrative that corresponds more closely to our current state of knowledge. If humans did not spend 95% of their evolutionary past in tiny bands of hunter-gatherers, then what were they doing all that time? If agriculture in cities did not mean a plunge into hierarchy and domination, then what did they imply? What was really happening in those periods we usually see as marking the emergence of the state? The answers are often unexpected and suggest that the course of human history may be less set in stone and more full of playful possibilities than we tend to assume. I just thought that was a nice summary of what they're trying to do here before we jump into chapter 2.
Well, if we pretend my cats are like, hunter-gatherers, then they probably spent 20 hours sleeping, right? Like,
Think about how many people are sleep deprived because of work today. Like, that's so funny, but really true. A lot of people just need more time to sleep, and they don't get it because work sucks.
Have you ever seen a reality TV show called Naked and Afraid?
Yep.
It's kind of like if you watch those and they're there for like, some of the shows do like 30 days and some of them do like longer where they're in groups or whatever. But they basically do absolutely nothing except for like an hour where like they have to go hunt and find like food. And then they come back and they rest the entire time just to conserve calories and do absolutely nothing. Let's get back to that.
There's some old labor organizing chant. It was like 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will. And that's how we got the 8-hour workday. It was sort of around that idea, but we need a new one that has like, 12 hours a day for sleep or something like that.
There's probably like 3 to 5 hours where like you're highly productive and like actually working in any given day. And the rest is just like kind of garbage, like fluff. And if you get off task, you got to get back in it. And that takes time. I'll work 3 really good hours. Okay. I just need the same salary.
Yeah, I agree. I'll burn out after 3 or 4 hard hours of like, especially if it's like mental work, like you got to be in a document typing or something. Oh God, 3 hours max. And I'm burnt out on that kind of work. So chapter 2 is all about this early contact intellectually that European colonists had with indigenous groups in North America. And it really gets into the history of this question of inequality, of where this whole concept comes from. And so just kind of wanted to start there. I know eventually we're going to get to this fantastic character, Kondiaronk, who I'm just a huge fan of after reading this chapter. It's got lots of really good critiques about European culture, but I thought it was interesting the way they do this because, like, we can talk about Hobbes or we can talk about Rousseau, some of these famous names from history that we learned about in school, but we don't often get to learn about how those people came up with their ideas, of where those conversations came from. And this chapter, in a large way, is explaining where Rousseau got all of his ideas from in the first place in order to write this influential work, Yeah, it was just sort of pie in the sky ideas he was coming up with, but he was pulling together threads of conversations that were happening in Europe at the time based on this early contact colonists had with indigenous groups. And part of their main argument in this chapter, I think, is that the critiques that indigenous intellectuals made against European culture sort of did their work in Europe, passing around the cafes and salons, people talking about it, debating it. And that turned into this European notion of inequality and democracy and how government should be done for the greater good. And this whole arc of history sort of emerges as a response to critiques that were made against European culture. And before this contact with indigenous groups, Europeans weren't really talking about inequality. It wasn't like a concept that they were working with in their debates or anything. And this is kind of where I want to start on page 32. This first paragraph is talking about that. The first thing to emphasize is that the origin of social inequality is not a problem which would have made sense to anyone in the Middle Ages. Ranks and hierarchies were assumed to have existed from the very beginning, even in the Garden of Eden, as the 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas observed. Adam clearly outranked Eve. Social equality, and therefore its opposite, inequality, simply did not exist as a concept. So yeah, just sort of this idea that the concept of inequality, as we're working with it philosophically, what do we think about it as only happening after colonization started, right? Like, I don't know, we tend to think of it like, oh, this is a problem that people were working through all the way since the ancient Greeks or whatever, but I don't know, that's kind of putting the origin point of this whole concept with the indigenous people that colonists came into contact with. Doesn't sound like a coherent question, but does that make sense?
Yeah. It was interesting. I guess like I was trying to think about it from the perspective of a peasant in the Middle Ages. Like, if you're born into that system, right, and like your parents were born into this system, and it's like, there's a king, he's ordained by God, the Pope said it. If the church is essentially what has ruled for generations, and that's all you know, I mean, I'm sure there was concepts of people being like, well, this sucks, like, this is unfair, like, I feel like this is wrong or something like that. But at the same time, if like that's all you've had your entire life, like where would you, I don't know, like, I guess it makes sense to me that like that might not just like naturally come up as a concept if it's just kind of one of these things that's just taken as an immutable fact, I guess, from where you're born.
Yeah, it just seems that, it's like obviously top wealth and power are funding these directly, these tales directly, and these state-sponsored thoughts that are coming forward. And it's like the story of once you start farming, inequality is inevitable. It's just obvious that people with money and power want this to seem unavoidable, and they want this structure to seem like it's in place to justify their own thing. And it's all in these indigenous cultures where other ideas of social inequality and things are coming from. It's not like wrapped into one grand tale that we all get told and like this great mythos, and they're actually like addressed and they have reasonings, if whatever. So yeah.
And to go one step further, there are some of the, what I'm thinking of is like which kings like were bought in, right? Like which ones were like, I am picked by God, versus the ones that, I know what's going on here. Like, because there had to be some, right, that are okay, but this is clearly how the power structure works. But there also had to be a ton of people that bought that line, bought the propaganda, were completely bought in and believed in the institution, right? Like that they were part of.
Yeah, it seems like it kind of like top down. It serves obviously the monarchy, and then it's probably like, the business owners. And the only people that the narrative doesn't serve are the people who can't do anything. So it's pretty convenient.
Yeah, definitely.
But also, like, as a funny side with the whole, what kings are believing their God or whatever, I've always thought, like, if I were born and like they're like, Arthur, you're the king of England, I would 100% believe like Jesus Christ put me there, like no doubt. Wouldn't you, if you were like the king? True. I would be like, yes, this is ordained.
Yeah.
Especially if you pulled that sword out of the stone that nobody else could get.
Totally.
So yeah, this whole thing just makes you think of like how, I don't know, it just really drives home all the propaganda that I've been fed all through school. We get this narrative about what the point of the New World was, why people came over here. It was for freedom. It was for democracy. These weren't even concepts at the time that people were working with when the colonization process started. Like the colonies started because they were business adventures. Then they wanted new resources, and they found slaves, they found resources, they expelled indigenous people, and they tried to turn a profit. And then later we've retroactively put this whole narrative about democracy and freedom onto the whole project as if that was the point from the beginning. But there were just peasant workers along for the ride that became part of the general population. But yeah, there are examples in this text of different critiques that Europeans are hit with. from indigenous people, and they're kind of shocking. Like, one of the groups that is talked about a lot in this chapter are the Jesuits, the Jesuit missionaries, who are sort of the intellectuals of the Catholic world, and they're trained to evangelize. And so they come over to the colonies, they learn the indigenous languages in order to be able to have conversations about religion, in order to try to convert the indigenous people over to Catholicism. And in that process, they're just kind of shook by the robust debating skills of the indigenous people that they did not expect. Because these indigenous communities have these ways of living that are very debate-oriented. Like, nobody's really in charge in a meaningful way other than the extent to which he can persuade other people to agree with him, right? They mention that regularly, like the chief is in charge, but only because he's convincing. As soon as he stops being convincing, people are going to stop following him. And so they're constantly having to have these debates and have these discussions about what to do, and that kind of hones the skills of discussion. If you have to debate with your community every single day about what's important to do, what's important not to do, this kind of stuff, you're going to get pretty good at debating. And so these Europeans come over and try to tell you about Jesus and try to tell you about the king and all this stuff, and it's just going to come across as silly, and it does. And some of these indigenous people make comments to that effect, which I think are really telling. On page 38, there's one quick example. There's a French father in the religious sense. Father Pierre Biard was a former theology professor assigned in 1608 to evangelize the Algonquian-speaking Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, who lived near the French. Biard did not think much of the Mi'kmaq, but reported that the feeling was mutual. And they have some quotes from I guess this French father's journal or writings or whatever. These are quotes from him. He says, "They consider themselves better than the French." And here's the father quoting the indigenous people he's talking to. "For, they say, you are always fighting and quarreling amongst yourselves. We live peaceably. You are envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. And for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor." They are saying these things continually, said the father. And they kept saying that they were richer than the French, because even though the French had greater assets, they had ease, comfort, and time. How about those as cultural values? Ease, comfort, and time. Kind of begs the question of what we're progressing towards. Like, this whole idea of progress in history, of going towards something. These people that we colonized said that they already had this thing that we're still striving for, right? We're striving for a world of ease, comfort, and time, but that's the world we kicked out in order to build this one. Like, the fuck is going on here?
It's a little backwards. Abundance of resources, yeah. Well, that's what AI is going to bring us, right?
Well, they didn't have multi-use plastics, okay?
That's true. Did they
Come
have
on.
56 different kinds of soap and shampoo to choose from?
Yeah. I bet they
No
can't
idea what they're missing.
buy bottled water, okay, that Nestle owns.
There were a couple things there. It's funny. I actually had that section highlighted too, Joe. So that's like, I don't know, 3 book in a row that we've had the same stuff. But there was a couple things that I wanted to mention. You were talking about how there were individuals that came to like proselytize and try to convert. But I wanted to read this paragraph. It was actually on page 32. It was right after the one that you were reading there. It's important to remember that the Spanish adventurers like Cortez and Pizarro carried out their conquests largely without authorization from higher authorities. Afterwards, there were intense debates back home over whether such unvarnished aggression against people who, after all, posed no threat to Europeans could really be justified. So I'm going to pause for a sec. I just thought that was interesting, like, because I don't think we really hear about that very much. Like, oh, there was debate back in Europe as to like, are we doing like genocide in North America? Like, what is going on? And then there's this next part here. The key problem was that unlike non-Christians of the old world who could be assumed to have had the opportunity to learn the teachings of Jesus and therefore have actively rejected them, it was fairly obvious that the inhabitants of the New World simply never had any exposure to Christian ideas, so they couldn't be classified as infidels. The conquistadors generally finessed this question by reading a declaration in Latin calling on all the Indians to convert before attacking them. As there's more here that is interesting in that paragraph, but it's just crazy to be one. It's like, oh, we found a loophole for God, so we can just say this thing and then we can kill all these people, and God's cool with that. That's fair. Yeah, so it was just kind of ridiculous. So the two things out of there is one, there was active debate, and it made me think a little bit about the Gaza situation right now. We don't hear about it very much, but there's huge protests from in Israel from Israelis that all are debating this too, right? So that kind of stuck out to me as a parallel. And then just the whole loophole for God thing that continues to come up. You're supposedly serving this omnipotent, present individual, but he didn't think about that, I guess.
And the Mormons have a story about Jesus in Mississippi or something now, right? They covered their tracks on that one.
No, I think it was upstate New York. I'm pretty sure he found some gold plates up here in upstate New York.
Oh shit. Yeah, that I was thinking about that as you were reading just now too. Of how it's a similar situation. There were monarchies in Europe that had a lot of coin to spend, and they found people like Columbus and Cortez and others, and they're like, hey, here's some money, here's some ships, go explore some shit, find something for me. And then they didn't really know what these quote-unquote explorers were up to. Genocide is mostly what they were up to, and plundering villages and people and stuff. But then they come back, and people in Europe get stories about it, and they're like, wait, that's what you were doing? Oh. It already happened now, and now we're just having this debate about what to do about it after the fact. And a lot of the same things have been happening all throughout the 20th century, how many of the atrocities in Vietnam or the bombing of Laos or Cambodia that we only learn about after the fact. Oh, the Defense Department was just dropping bombs on all these other countries that weren't even involved. Well, we can't stop it now. It already happened. And now we're sitting here having this debate about it. It's a similar situation. It's the same. That's why I always try to draw that line through colonialism and capitalism, is because it's the same project that's still been going on. Same tactics anyway. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about as you were saying that. So my only other main things to talk about are really Kondiaronk and maybe some of his connections to Rousseau. If you guys have anything there you want to go to, feel free. But essentially, I can't remember off the top of my head what La Fontaine's story is, but there's a French guy, La Fontaine, who has these prolonged arguments with Kondiaronk, who is an Indigenous leader in what's now Quebec. So I don't know the Canadian provinces, the French ones and everything, but it's where the French had colonized Canada. And so a lot of these writings work their way through Europe, and people accused La Fontaine, the guy who wrote them down, of just making them up whole cloth. Oh, these conversations never happened. But there actually is evidence that this person not only had many, many conversations with European leaders, but also traveled to Europe for some period of time and had close contact with European culture and stuff. I'm trying to pick what I want to read, and I'm having a hard time.
I had one of his things highlighted if you want me to start with that.
Yeah, go for it.
Because the Kondiaronk thing, there was so many to pick from, right? He has so many good passages and quotes and everything in here. The one that I highlighted was on page 55. So this comes after a couple of things. I think in the one right before this, he talks about spending 6 years reflecting on the European society. But this next section on page 55 is actually not one of the direct quotes, but I'm just going to read this middle paragraph. So, for Europeans in 1703, this was heady stuff. Much of the subsequent exchange consists of the French trying to convince Kondiaronk of the advantages of adopting European civilization, and Kondiaronk countering that the French would do much better to adopt the Wendat way of life. Do you seriously imagine, he says, that I would be happy to live like one of the inhabitants of Paris, to take 2 hours every morning just to put on a shirt and makeup, to bow, to scrape before every obnoxious galoot I meet on the street who happen to be born with an inheritance? Do you really imagine I could carry a purse full of coins and not immediately hand them over to people who are hungry? That I would carry a sword but not immediately draw it on the first band of thugs I see rounding up the destitute to press into naval service? If, on the other hand, La Fontaine were to adopt an American way of life, Kondiaronk tells him, it might take a while to adjust, but in the end he'd be far happier. Yeah, and then it points back to like other individuals who have been in an American way of life, American as in the Native Americans, and gone back to that instead of going back to Western society there. So I thought that was a pretty good summation, but so many good quotes from him in this chapter.
Yeah, and it's like this question they're playing with is like the question about the origin of inequality. It's like inequality doesn't really occur to the Europeans until this indigenous person is like, we're way freer than you guys are. You guys don't even have any freedom. You're all slaves to your kings and your capitalists and your merchants, and like I pity you. Your way of life is miserable. And that's when Europeans are finally like, wait a minute, are we free? What even is freedom? What are we doing here? And that's where all these conversations start. But yeah, that was a great moment you picked.
Well, the one line there that he talks about, like, do I need to bow and scrape before every obnoxious galoot I meet in the street who happens to have been born with an inheritance? I'm wondering if there's just a time thing there between what, like, or a translation, or what I mean is, like, when he says any galoot that has an inheritance, does that inherently refer to someone that's part of the aristocracy of the time? Like, is that like, obviously it's not just like anyone that's got money, right? So it's like specifically talking about,
That's how
yeah. And I guess it made me think more about like just military service in the way that you're constantly, at least as a junior enlisted, you're constantly kind of on edge, because like anyone that is a higher rank could like come around the corner at any time and just rip you up for basically nothing. And then I just thought about an entire society kind of living like that, in that rigid hierarchical structure where you like accidentally bump into someone on the street and then all of a sudden you're getting your hand cut off. Like, I don't know, I'm making stuff up. There's a parallel there to like having lived in a very hierarchical society where, yeah, you can get in trouble for minor things.
Absolutely. No, I think the culture clash between enlisted and commissioned directly ties to like aristocracy and peasantry or whatever. Howard Zinn talks about that when the American Revolution started and peasants were signing up and noticing that they were getting paid like, I don't know, 50 cents or $1 a week or something, and officers, lieutenants were getting $75 a week. And it was just like, what?
Yeah.
And a funny story, at my job school training, you were speaking about this anxiety as a junior enlisted of an officer might pop around the corner and, oh no, am I going to notice them? Am I going to salute in time? Whatever. That happened to me. I was just walking around the corner near the barracks and some lieutenant came around the corner and I tried to whip my hand up to salute and I smashed my elbow into the wall right beside me while I was doing, because I wasn't even paying attention. I was just so nervous and like, you know, just like a PFC worried about upsetting people or whatever. But it's like, it does stuff to you psychologically. It's a weird culture to be in for a while.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
The other things that I want to go to are near the end of the chapter. Is there anything in the middle, Arthur, that's on your mind that you wanted to talk about before we move towards the end?
Before, the main thing that stuck out to me, I guess, probably from a philosophy major where you're told these canonical philosophers are thought makers that change our world around us, is that Kondiaronk was talking about how, you know, describing to these European leaders the actual ways in which they live. And it was like a living reality. It's not like a mythic past. And how Rousseau like absorbs some of these ideas, but then kind of changes them and puts on this like noble savage's tale that paints it as more of like a lost golden age rather, and like recasts it, I guess, rather than like, no, it's an alternative to like right now. And I'm telling you, it's like, that is just so frustrating that somebody is giving an example of like, this is the reality in which we live. And somebody's like, oh yeah, well, that's a fairy tale. Like, there's no, what? I would just scream at that guy. Like, and then of course it conveniently fits the narrative of like, you know, whatever the European tale wants to be or whatever. And the other thing I think, which was kind of in the middle, was this term I've never heard before of schismogenesis. You know, and it was like this idea of like how societies differentiated themselves in different values because they want to be unlike others and kind of distinguish themselves. And so that was just a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said all of that. The schismogenesis thing, I think, is important to talk about in the beginning, because I think it's going to come back again and again throughout the book. They're going to come back to this concept of schismogenesis. It's like you're saying, the idea that it happens individually. In order to define yourself, you have to define yourself in terms that distinguish you from others, right? I am myself in that I am different from this person and that person, and that's where I get my individuality from. It's the same thing with social groups. Social groups have a tendency to define themselves against other groups, and those contrary definitions get exacerbated over time as cultures clash, and so you can see heightened differences resulting in a war eventually when people really feel like they're different enough. But this concept of schismogenesis is really important throughout the book. And the other thing you said too about how Rousseau kind of almost infantilized indigenous people in terms of this grand narrative of human history. And it's something I can't find the moment in the text fast enough, but they point out these two ways that Europeans tend to dismiss indigenous groups. And one of them is like the violent, savage past. Therefore, your opinions don't matter because your culture is inferior. Or the other side of the spectrum is to sort of deify them as this romanticized, ancient way of living, this lost form of human innocence. And you can't really have a conversation with that group either because you're doing so much romanticizing about their identity. We're all just human beings with different ways of living. And so the indigenous people in the colonial era are like, no, we currently live like this, and you could too. You could change, like you're saying. But then they find ways, like Rousseau does, of just dismissing them as these noble savages. Right?
Yeah, it reminded me of some modern politics in a few ways. One is I've heard political people praise the wisdom of indigenous groups, and like at the same token, they're like trying to like strip them of all their land and rights. And then the other thing is in socialism, or maybe more like labor movements, you have to talk about like, oh, the spirit of, you know, this labor movement is really important. But then like when it comes time to like voting for any sort of livable wage or anything, that's no. So it's just another disregard of an actual account of what is happening, and just to fit the narrative of the state-sponsored propaganda.
And I guess before we kind of get to the end and close out, I think there's one thing that connects there that I find interesting. Is like, I can't remember if the comparison was directly made in the book or not, but you know how we hear a lot about Greek philosophers, right? And their debate and how that was like a huge thing back in ancient Greece. And they were kind of like, well, obviously the thought leaders, but until starting this book, I hadn't really heard anything about Native American philosophers. And it's just interesting them being like these master debaters, really, right? And that was what they used in order to kind of control their society. It seemed like the chiefs had to be great speakers and you had to be good orators to convince people that you're right. So it seems like there's a parallel there, but we never really talk about that. We only hear about Greek philosophers, I guess. So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's huge part of it. And it's hard to unlearn all that stuff because like the way we get taught in school, the whole foundation of this intellectual tradition they teach us about starts there. Like if it doesn't start in Greece, where does it start? You know, I got to have an origin somewhere. And it's like, again, it's like you were saying earlier, Arthur, it's hard to articulate, but you just got to crack open that point of view and just be willing to be creative and imaginative about all the different possibilities because there's so much intellectual wisdom from indigenous groups to learn still.
Yeah.
And yeah, this book is, I think they do a good job of really trying to take those ideas seriously and give them credit for what they've done. One thing that I thought would be interesting, because we talked about it in the last episode when we briefly touched on it, we were talking about political identities and how we view ourselves along a spectrum of left versus right. I thought they sort of gave us a historical answer here near the end of this chapter on page 68 and 69. They say many conservative thinkers see Rousseau as having gone full circle from a promising start to creating what we now think of as the political left. Nor are they entirely wrong in this. Rousseau was indeed a crucial figure in the formation of left-wing thought. One reason intellectual debates of the mid-18th century seem so strange to us nowadays is precisely that what we understand as left-right divisions had not yet crystallized. At the time of the American Revolution, the terms left and right themselves did not yet exist. a product of the decade immediately following. They originally referred to the respective seating positions of aristocratic and popular factions in the French National Assembly of 1789. So, French Revolutionary era, you got aristocrats on one side of the aisle and popular factions, aka the people or the more middle-class people on the other side. And so, if you're aligned with the right side of the spectrum, you're aligned with the aristocracy. If you're aligned with the left side of the spectrum, you're aligned with the people. And that's kind of what left versus right still means in a lot of ways, I feel like, today. I don't know. Do we think that still tracks or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Until,
is there any
until they
differences
flip
there?
it. Until they flip it. And, Republicans aren't Republicans. And, they love to do it.
But yeah, I mean, if also the parallel of, essentially being wealthy in America is being part of the aristocracy, right? Like that's essentially what the equivalent there would be. So yeah, I feel like that metaphor carries.
Similar to the last chapter, I think they do a good job of summarizing their point of view and ending and sort of redirecting us towards what's going to come afterwards. But I kind of just wanted to read the last paragraph of this chapter to see where we are in the book, to see how we feel about the book, and if there's anything left we want to discuss about what we're looking forward to or ideas that are just on our minds about all of this material in general. It's kind of a hard thing to talk about because it just gives you so much to think about, and it kind of feels like a big messy soup I just got to let simmer in the mind for a while. This last paragraph of the second chapter, they say, this is not then a book about the origins of inequality, but it aims to answer many of the same questions in a different way. There is no doubt that something has gone terribly wrong with the world. A very small percentage of its population do control the fates of almost everyone else. And they are doing it in an increasingly disastrous fashion. To understand how this situation came about, we should trace the problem back to what first made possible the emergence of kings, priests, overseers, and judges. But we no longer have the luxury of assuming we already know in advance what the precise answers will turn out to be. Taking guidance from indigenous critics like Kondiaronk, we need to approach the evidence of the human past with fresh eyes. Where did the kings and priests and overseers and judges come from? What are those systems? How did they originate? This is all the stuff we're going to get into in later chapters. Yeah. Anything idea-wise lingering on your guys' minds as we finish these first two chapters?
Yeah. I guess the one that I kind of like just gnaws at the back of my head when I'm listening to this or reading through different sections is, or maybe it's just a question that maybe we can answer as we get through the book, but how much of it applies to like the modern human? I was thinking about the history it talks about in the very first chapter of, of the 200,000 years that humans have been around. We've only been keeping history for the last 5,000. And then I was just thinking more about how we interact and live has just changed over the last 100 years, right? Like, and what impacts that have. I guess it's like the one thing that I can't quite rationalize in my head is like, how do we compare, the standard of living? I don't know if that's really the right word here, of the 1700s to today. And can we even take those lessons and somehow apply them with how everything's changed so much, like we were talking about technologically, industrially, or whatnot? But I guess that gnaws at the back of my head, but at the same time, I'm trying to just like put that away and just absorb, which is a little bit difficult. But yeah, that's one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading.
Yeah, I really like that. I think the most that has stuck around is I think you could probably genetically trace the money. It's still the same families in charge. And they're some of them are on pedestals. In the UK, some people just love the royals.
Mm-hmm.
They own some percentage of all the land, and whatever. Anyway, I really liked the book so far. The thoughts that are ruminating in my head are obviously philosophers are just individuals who probably love money as much as the next person. And they're they're political. And I really liked the idea that the democratic ideals that we have, or some of them, do have indigenous roots. And so maybe our tale should reflect that, because that is not at all what we're telling ourselves. We tell ourselves that, it's always white men that come up with these great ideas. And then I really liked that there was presented a third way, the Hobbes Leviathan thing is obviously flawed, and Rousseau's like fall from grace of society is flawed. And I liked that these other ways experimented with how we live. And if they've done that before, we can do it again, and we don't have to accept hierarchy as the price. So I don't know, just really some really nice positive thoughts, actually.
Yeah. What you said about democracy really hit me too. When I listened to this book on tape a long time ago, the thing that stuck out to me the most is like just shook my understanding of history in a big way was the idea that democracy is an idea we colonized from indigenous people. There's a wonderful episode in one of the later chapters about Cortez and his efforts to overthrow the Aztecs in Mexico. He couldn't do it with his little band of 2,000 soldiers. He needed to enlist the help of another indigenous group who was also against the Aztecs. The Aztecs were kind of bullying everybody, and they were like, oh, if we get these guys on our side, maybe we can take them. Those people they needed to get on their side were a democracy. And it was frustrating for Cortez because he would talk to some of their people and they'd be like, okay, we got to go back and debate and have a vote and talk about it for a while. And he's like all frustrated and impatient. What's going on here? And then, so they eventually agreed, and spoiler alert, they took over the Aztecs with those people's help. And then, of course, Cortez turned on them too and took them over as well. And then we don't hear about them anymore, conveniently. But yeah, they already had democracy, like fully fledged democracy in indigenous communities. And I want to respond to what you were saying, Kodie, about relevance for today. I think I have a similar kind of thing in that it's hard to like, I feel like I need to put all the pieces together and make it make sense in a way that feels useful and practical. And I think it's important to remember that what we're doing right now has never been done before. There's never been a coherent, organized human society that understands itself in the same terms. There's never been a moment where the whole globe of human beings came together and were like, oh, we're the same people. We're all from the same place. Let's talk about what that means. And that's kind of what this book is trying to do. And kind of what we all need to do going forward in the world is like, we have a globalized society. We have this advanced technology. We also have crazy amounts of oppression and exploitation and suffering. Is there a way we can use this big perspective and these convenient technologies to correct all that suffering and exploitation and still, live comfortably with each other? It's a big problem, an impossible problem that might not get solved in our lifetimes, but it's kind of where we're at as a species, I feel like, is trying to figure out who we all are together at the same time on the same planet. Yeah. Those are the thoughts around my mind for this book.
I like it.
Any closing thoughts for this episode?
Not for me. I'm excited for the rest of the book. It's been great. I was listening to it over the weekend and then went back through yesterday and today to get the sections that I wanted to talk about. But yeah, it's super interesting so far. Really excited to finish this one out.
Yeah, kind of chunky chapters in this book. My challenge, I felt like, especially with the second chapter, is it's like over 50 pages of material. There's so much to be talked about that could be talked about, and it just feels impossible to decide sometimes. Hopefully I'll get better at that as we go along and be slightly more organized in the questions. But yeah, it'll be a sort of a slow burn as conversations go. I think we're scheduling 6 episodes on this book, 2 chapters per episode. So yeah, we'll look forward to those continuing conversations. Like I said before, find us on Twitch if you want to catch the live readings or recordings of the live readings. Pick up a copy of The Dawn of Everything, read along with us, join our conversations. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what is our subreddit, r/Propaganda Loves You.
Yeah, there's some spaces in there, but you can get to it from our Blue Sky too. We've got a link to Reddit and our website.
Thanks, guys, for the conversation. It's been great. Looking forward to the next one. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.